In the annals of ancient history, one legend has stood the test of time, a tale of genius and bravery that has captivated the world for centuries. But what if the truth behind Hannibal's epic campaign against Rome has been shrouded in myth? What if the stories we know of Rome's resilience, of her unbroken will, of her destined triumph, are not the truth at all, but the greatest deception ever told? For behind the marble facades and triumphant chronicles lies a darker reality. Rome wasn't invincible. Rome was broken, humiliated, and nearly destroyed by a man whose very name brought terror to her gates. This is the story Rome did not want the world to remember. The story of Hannibal Barca and the biggest lie in ancient history. In the annals of ancient history, one legend has stood the test of time, a tale of genius and bravery that has captivated the world for centuries. But what if the truth behind Hannibal's epic campaign against Rome has been shrouded in myth? What if the story we've inherited, the story of Rome's resilience, of her unbroken will, of her destined empire, was built on a lie? For over 2 millennia, Rome has told us who she was: the conqueror of nations, the unbreakable republic, the empire that could not be defeated. But beneath the triumphal arches, beneath the marble inscriptions and proud speeches, there lies another story. A story Rome could never fully erase. It is the story of a boy, born in Carthage, whose very childhood was bound by an oath sworn in the shadow of war, sealed in hatred, and carried for a lifetime. His name was Hannibal Barca. At 25, he commanded armies. At 30, he crossed mountains thought impassable. At 31, he annihilated Rome's legions in battles so devastating that even today, military academies still study his genius. Rome, the eternal city, was brought to its knees. Her soldiers slaughtered, her allies in revolt, her people in panic. At Cannae, the blood of 70,000 Romans stained the earth in a single day. Never before, and never again, would Rome suffer such terror. And yet, in the histories that survived, written by Roman pens, these defeats were recast. They were softened, diminished, retold as mere setbacks on Rome's inevitable path to glory. Hannibal's victories became footnotes. Rome's desperation became resilience, and the world was taught to believe that Rome was always destined to rule. But destiny is a story the victors tell. The truth is far more fragile, far more human. Rome wasn't invincible. Rome was nearly destroyed, and only betrayal, not Roman strength, saved her. This is the story of how propaganda outlived reality. The story of how the greatest general of antiquity became a shadow in Rome's chronicles. This is the biggest lie in ancient history: Hannibal versus Rome.
The year was 247 BCE. Carthage, the great merchant empire of North Africa, stood wounded. Its harbors bustled with trade, its ships still ruled the western Mediterranean, but beneath the surface lay humiliation. Rome had dealt the first blow. The First Punic War, a brutal struggle fought across Sicily and the seas, had ended in disaster for Carthage. The once proud city was forced to pay crippling reparations. Sicily was lost. Carthage's fleet, once unmatched, was broken. And yet, in the Barca household, the fire of defiance still burned. Hamilcar Barca, the most brilliant Carthaginian general of his generation, refused to accept defeat as final. To his mind, the war had not ended, it had merely shifted. If Carthage could not challenge Rome in Sicily, it would rise again in Spain. There, beyond Rome's reach, new armies could be forged, new wealth drawn from silver mines, and new power built to confront the Republic once more. But before Hamilcar departed for Spain, he turned to his young son. Hannibal was only 9 years old. Ancient sources record the moment, a scene both intimate and monumental. Hamilcar took his boy by the hand and led him before the household gods. The air was heavy with incense, the fire burning low on the altar. There, Hamilcar commanded him to swear an oath. An oath that would define the course of his life. Hannibal placed his hand upon the sacrifice and vowed eternal hatred against Rome. It was not the vow of a child. It was a binding promise, one that would live in his blood and shadow every decision he made until his final breath. With this oath, Hannibal's fate was sealed. He was no longer merely a Carthaginian child. He was the heir of vengeance, chosen to continue the struggle his father had begun. In Spain, the Barca family built a new empire. Hamilcar led campaigns against Iberian tribes, securing alliances and wealth. When he fell in battle, his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair took command. And after Hasdrubal's assassination, the mantle passed to Hannibal himself. At just 25 years old, Hannibal Barca assumed control of Carthage's armies in Spain. His rise was not through politics or inheritance alone, his soldiers demanded it. They had seen him fight at their side. They had watched him endure the same hardships, share the same food, sleep under the same stars. He was not a distant aristocrat, he was their general. And with Hannibal at their head, the armies of Carthage prepared to challenge Rome once again. The spark would come at Saguntum, a city south of the river Ebro. Rome had declared the Ebro as the boundary of Carthaginian expansion. But Saguntum, though south of that line, claimed Roman friendship. Hannibal saw it as a provocation and an opportunity. In 219 BCE, he laid siege to Saguntum. The city fell after months of brutal resistance. Rome demanded Hannibal's surrender. Carthage refused. The oath sworn in childhood now erupted into history. The Second Punic War had begun. And in Hannibal's mind, this was not just a war of states or a clash of empires. It was a personal vow, burning in his soul since the day his father pressed his hand upon the altar. Rome had taken Carthage's pride, and Hannibal would stop at nothing until Rome itself was brought to its knees. The war had begun. But Hannibal Barca was no ordinary commander. He would not wait for Rome to bring the fight to Carthage. He would not sit idle in Spain while Roman fleets blockaded his harbors. Instead, he conceived a plan so audacious, so unthinkable, that it would echo through history for more than 2,000 years. He would take the fight directly to Italy. Most expected Hannibal to defend Spain or strike at Sicily. Rome's generals believed their borders were secure. The Alps, those towering walls of snow and stone, protected the Italian heartland. No army had ever crossed them with success. The mountains were not just a barrier, they were a weapon. And yet, Hannibal looked upon those frozen peaks and saw not an obstacle, but a gateway. In the spring of 218 BCE, he set his plan into motion. From New Carthage in Spain, his army marched north. Tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry, and a handful of Carthage's most exotic weapon, African war elephants. The journey itself was already monumental. Across the rivers of Gaul, through hostile tribes, along treacherous paths. At the river Rhone, Hannibal executed a daring crossing, even as Roman forces raced to intercept him. But when Rome arrived, Hannibal was already gone, slipping beyond their grasp, pressing onward to the mountains that loomed before him. And then, the impossible began. The Alps rose like jagged teeth against the sky, their ridges sharp with snow, their valleys dark with ice. Ancient sources tell us of the hardships that followed. Avalanches burying men and beasts, ambushes by hostile mountain tribes, storms that froze flesh and bone. Horses slid from narrow passes into the abyss. Pack animals plunged into torrents. Soldiers, frostbitten and starving, struggled to march through waist-deep snow. At times, the army hacked through ice with vinegar and fire, breaking pathways step by step. At other moments, men clung to the mountainside with nothing between them and death but their own trembling grip. Of the nearly 50,000 who set out for the Alps, barely half would emerge alive. But emerge they did. When Hannibal's army descended from the peaks into the fertile plains of northern Italy, they were battered, emaciated, and scarred, but they were there. Rome had not believed it possible. No enemy had ever appeared in Italy with such force. And yet here was Hannibal, his army behind him, his elephants leading the way like creatures out of myth. The shock rippled through the Republic. In their minds, the Alps were Rome's shield. Now that shield had been shattered. For Hannibal, this was more than a march. It was a declaration. The impossible had been made real. He had brought his oath across mountains, and now, on Roman soil, the war he had sworn as a boy would truly begin. Hannibal had done the impossible. He had crossed the Alps. But his march was not an act of theater, it was preparation for war. And soon, the war would reveal the full brilliance of his genius. The first clash came at the river Trebia. It was winter, the air biting with cold. Hannibal knew the Romans would be eager to strike, to drive this invader from their soil before he could take root. Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus marched with 40,000 men, confident in Roman discipline and superior numbers. Hannibal baited him. He sent his Numidian cavalry to harass the Roman lines, to provoke Longus into battle. And the consul, rash and impatient, took the bait. At dawn, he drove his legions across the freezing river, their armor soaked, their bodies numbed by icy water. On the far bank, Hannibal waited. His infantry met the Romans head-on, his cavalry swept around their flanks, and from the reeds of the riverbank, hidden troops erupted behind them. The Roman army was enveloped. Cut down. Routed. Thousands drowned in the river they had just crossed. Rome's first encounter with Hannibal on her own soil ended in disaster. But worse was to come. The following spring, Hannibal set his trap at Lake Trasimene. The geography itself became his weapon. Along a narrow road between steep hills and the misty lake, he hid his army in silence. Roman consul Gaius Flaminius, blind with confidence, marched straight into the jaws of death. At dawn, the Carthaginian ambush struck. From the hillsides, thousands poured down upon the unsuspecting columns. The Romans were pinned against the lake, unable to maneuver, unable even to see their enemy through the fog. Entire legions were cut to pieces. Flaminius himself was slain. 15,000 Romans fell in a single morning, the largest ambush in military history. The survivors were scattered, broken, humiliated. Rome trembled. Panic spread through the streets. Mothers whispered to children, "Hannibal is at the gates." But it was at Cannae that Hannibal reached the summit of his art. The Romans, desperate to end the terror, mustered the largest force they had ever fielded. Nearly 80,000 soldiers, double the size of Hannibal's army, marched to crush him once and for all. Hannibal, outnumbered, did not retreat. He positioned his men in a crescent formation, with his weakest troops in the center. When the Roman legions advanced, they pushed this center back, believing victory was theirs. But the crescent was a trap. As the Romans pressed forward, Hannibal's African veterans on the flanks wheeled inward. His cavalry, commanded by Hannibal, smashed the Roman horsemen and then struck from behind. The trap closed. The Romans were surrounded. What followed was slaughter. Packed tightly together, unable to move or fight, they were cut down where they stood. By the end of the day, between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans lay dead. Senators, consuls, the very elite of Rome were gone. Entire generations of noble families were extinguished in the dust of Cannae. It was not merely a defeat. It was annihilation. Never before had the Republic faced such terror. Allies defected. Armies collapsed. The road to Rome lay open. The truth is clear, Rome was broken. Rome was on her knees. And yet, in the histories that survive, written by Roman pens, these battles are described as setbacks, disasters, yes, but disasters that only proved Rome's resilience. The reality was far darker. At Trebia, at Trasimene, at Cannae, Rome came closer to extinction than at any other moment in her long history. And all of this was the work of one man. Hannibal Barca. The boy who swore an oath. The general who kept it. The shadow that haunted Rome. Rome was drowning in fear. At Trebia, at Trasimene, and most of all at Cannae, her legions had been butchered, her generals slain, her pride torn apart. In truth, the Republic stood on the brink of collapse. But history is not written in the heat of battle. It is written afterwards, by survivors, by victors, and by those with the power to shape memory. And Rome understood this truth better than anyone. The story Rome told the world was not the story of despair, or terror, or weakness. It was the story of destiny. In the histories that reached us, penned by Polybius, polished by Livy, repeated through the centuries, Hannibal's victories were acknowledged, yes, but never allowed to define Rome. They were framed as the accidents of fortune, the tricks of a cunning foreigner, the product of rash Roman commanders. Rome, in these accounts, never truly failed, she merely endured temporary setbacks on her inevitable path to triumph. But the reality was different. Rome was desperate. So desperate that after Cannae, the Senate armed slaves and criminals, promising freedom in exchange for service. Old men and boys too young for war were conscripted. Recruitment standards collapsed. Entire armies were gone, wiped from the face of the earth. And yet Rome claimed resilience. They told the world they were stronger for it. They called their ruin a lesson. Even their fear, their very terror, was hidden behind words. For generations, mothers whispered to children, "Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates." It was the phrase of dread, the reminder that death could arrive at any moment. Yet in their histories, this fear was silenced, reshaped into courage. Rome's greatest defeats became, in Roman hands, the soil of their glory. They lied, not by erasing Hannibal, but by diminishing him. By taking the man who nearly destroyed them and turning him into a shadow, a figure of menace, a foreign danger who only proved Rome's greatness by failing. But the truth is clear. At Trebia, at Trasimene, at Cannae, Rome did not merely stumble. She was broken, humiliated, and left clinging to survival. The biggest lie in ancient history is that Rome was destined for empire. The truth is that Rome only survived Hannibal by the narrowest of margins, and by a betrayal that would come not from her enemies, but from Hannibal's own homeland. Hannibal had done what no enemy of Rome had ever achieved. He had crossed the Alps, shattered her legions, and drained her lifeblood across the fields of Italy. For more than 15 years, he roamed the peninsula undefeated in open battle. And yet, the city that should have lifted him upon its shoulders, the city whose survival depended upon his genius, betrayed him. Hannibal expected reinforcements. He expected armies from Carthage, supplies from Africa, siege engines with which to strike at Rome itself. He had broken Rome on the battlefield, but Rome's walls stood beyond his reach. Without the tools of siege warfare, without fresh troops, he could not march upon the eternal city. Again and again, he sent pleas for help. And again, the Senate of Carthage hesitated. The truth is that Carthage was divided. Rival factions fought for power. Corruption rotted the heart of its politics. Some feared Rome too greatly. Others envied Hannibal's rising fame. Instead of unity, Hannibal found himself abandoned by the very homeland he fought to defend. While he bled Rome, Carthage squandered its chance. Opportunities slipped away. Italy burned with revolt, cities and tribes defected to Hannibal's side, but without Carthaginian reinforcements, the rebellion could not last. Year after year, Hannibal fought alone. His soldiers grew weary, his elephants perished, his Iberians longed for home. He fought not only Rome, but time itself. And still, Carthage delayed. The betrayal was not sudden, but slow and suffocating. It was silence when he needed action. It was hesitation when he demanded resolve. It was a city turning its back on the oath he had carried since boyhood. Hannibal had delivered Rome to Carthage's doorstep. And Carthage, blinded by division and cowardice, refused to open the door. That was the fatal wound, not Cannae, not Trasimene, not the Alps, but betrayal by his own people. For in the end, Rome did not save itself. Carthage handed Rome her survival. Rome had been broken, but not destroyed. Time and betrayal had given her space to recover. From the ashes of defeat, a new commander arose, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus. Scipio learned from Hannibal. He studied his battles, his maneuvers, his use of deception. While Hannibal remained stranded in Italy, Scipio struck at Spain, cutting off Carthage's wealth and armies at their source. Victory after victory forced Carthage into retreat. And then, Scipio did what Hannibal had long dreamed of: he carried the war to Africa. Carthage, at last, recalled its greatest general. After more than 15 years on Italian soil, Hannibal returned home to defend the city that had abandoned him. In 202 BCE, the two greatest commanders of their age faced one another on the plains of Zama. Hannibal was older now, hardened by years of war, but no longer commanding the army that had once terrified Rome. His veterans of Cannae were gone. His elephants, once mighty symbols of fear, were few and unreliable. His cavalry was outmatched. The battle began with the elephants. They charged, but many panicked under Roman trumpets and scattered into Hannibal's own lines. Scipio's cavalry clashed with Carthage's horsemen, and drove them from the field. What followed was a test of infantry. Hannibal's Carthaginians fought with desperate courage, but the Romans held. And when Scipio's cavalry returned, striking from behind, Hannibal's army was crushed. Zama was not just defeat. It was the end of Carthage as a power. The terms were brutal. Carthage was stripped of its fleet, forbidden to wage war without Rome's permission, forced to pay crushing tribute. The empire of the Barcids was no more. And Hannibal, the man who had brought Rome to her knees, now bore the weight of exile. He remained a figure of fear. Rome demanded his surrender, and so he fled. He became a wanderer, an advisor to foreign kings, still plotting against the republic that haunted his every step. But Rome's shadow was long. Her envoys pursued him across the Mediterranean, never resting until he was found. At last, cornered and unwilling to be paraded through Rome in chains, Hannibal chose his own fate. He swallowed poison, ending his life with one final act of defiance. His reported last words cut deep across the centuries: "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long endured, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for the death of an old man." With that, Hannibal Barca, the terror of Rome, the boy who swore an oath, the general who made the impossible real, was gone. Rome stood victorious. But her victory was not born of destiny, nor of invincibility. It was born of time, of Carthage's betrayal, and of one final battle on the African plain. Rome endured. But endurance is not invincibility. Rome's survival was not the work of destiny, nor of divine favor. It was the product of betrayal in Carthage, and the sacrifices of a republic driven to desperation. And yet, that is not the story the world remembers. Rome controlled not only armies, but words. Rome shaped the memory of its wars. Her historians, Livy, Polybius, and those who followed, wrote a version of events that buried the truth beneath the triumphs of empire. They admitted Hannibal's victories, yes, but diminished them, wrapping disaster in the language of resilience. The lie was simple, and it was powerful: Rome never truly lost. Rome was always destined to rule. Rome could be beaten, but never broken. And so, Hannibal became less than he was. Not the man who annihilated Rome's armies, not the general who held Italy in fear for a generation, but a villain in Rome's legend, a dark figure whose ultimate failure proved her greatness. But the truth remains, waiting beneath the marble facades. Rome was shaken to its core. Rome was vulnerable. Rome was mortal. And it was only because Carthage betrayed its greatest general that the world did not speak Punic instead of Latin. Hannibal Barca proved that empires bleed, that myths of invincibility are fragile, that history itself can be twisted into the service of power. 2,000 years later, we still live in the shadow of Rome's story. But listen closely, and you can still hear another voice, the echo of a boy's oath, sworn in the temples of Carthage, carried across mountains, carved into the earth at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. Rome may have buried it beneath her lies. But history remembers. And the greatest lie in ancient history remains this: that Rome was unbreakable. For once, long ago, Hannibal Barca came within a breath of proving otherwise. If this journey through history has shaken what you thought you knew, remember, history is never only what is written. It is also what is hidden. If you want to uncover more forgotten truths, more buried lies, and more stories that shaped our world, join us. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Because together, we can bring to light the voices that empire tried to silence, and keep alive the stories they wanted us to forget.